All right, so our next guest is Julian Besem, and he's going to be presenting models of accessible abstraction. So Julian Besem is a PhD candidate at ETH Zurich and a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. At the Bartlett, he teaches on the MArch, Urban Design Program, leading RC11 as a design tutor. He is conducting his PhD research at the Chair of Digital Architectonics with Ludger Halberstadt as primary supervisor and Roberto Bottazzi as secondary supervisor. Prior to pursuing his PhD, he worked as a junior architect at Waldmund Studio. He received a master's degree in architecture from UCL and a bachelor's degree from Newcastle University. In addition to his architectural studies, he completed a bachelor in computer science with a minor in mathematics at the Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen. His research focuses on how computational literacy can change the way in which we think about architectural design, approached from an abstract algebraic perspective in order to express the nature of the domains of architectural communication, and throughout a more applied approach relying on computational experiments to explore the integration of computational theory in architectural design methodologies. Welcome.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, I look forward, thanks for letting me speak and hope you enjoy. Oh, right. Yes. I'll also be running the presentation from a notebook, so it's interactive. Hopefully everything works. I think it should, but we'll find out. I'll start with, so the title of my talk is Models of Accessible Abstraction, which is a term taken from this quote by Junya Ishigami, where he discusses the design process he went through for the Kate workshop in Kanagawa, I think. So he says that he sees promise in this, in something as indefinite and ambiguous as a cluster of stars, becoming oriented into a very particular and enduring image or state, and see in this a kind of accessible abstractness. And I think whilst Ishigami is maybe not particularly a computational architect, I think many of the ideas that he discusses are very relevant for rethinking the way in which we design with computational methods rather than having computational methods designed for us, which is the main topic that I'll be speaking about. And then I'll first go through some the theoretical things relating to my PhD, and at the end I'll show some experiments that I think make a beginning of how I try to synthesize that in some form of methodology. So when we think about the current way in which architecture is encoded within computational models, this is the main prominent way in which digital architecture manifests itself. So we get an ever more detailed definition through geometry in BIM models or 3D models. And those models then, in turn, mediate all other means of communicating those designs, be it floor plans, sections, elevations, renders, and even videos. But through that process, we keep on adding more and more detail in the design process, and more geometric specificity, but it doesn't actually really embrace the more broader complexity that I think architectural design also requires. And that broader complexity, I kind of refer to the multi-disciplinary nature of architecture, which is already hinted at by Vitruvius in his 10 books of architecture on the education of the architect, where beyond just the geometry of architecture, he also things that the architect should know, things about history, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy and theory of the heavens. So, hold on, let me put this. So and then carrying this on with the actual nature of computation is that in contrast to a 3D model where everything lives in an encoding of Cartesian space, computational encoding does not need to be limited to those 3 dimensions. So as a kind of a very simple example, but I think it's quite nice to demonstrate how already a kind of a pre-trained existing model, we can use that to look at, here, an example of gardens, which then lets us see relations and distances between qualitative images without needing to look at the geometry. So for instance, the first garden, if we use the mobile net pre-trained without doing anything to encode this image, we get a feature vector of 1,000 numbers, which, I mean, these 1,000 numbers, because it's the actual outcome, it's the probabilities of every category of this image being one of those categories, but in reality, they don't really mean anything to us beyond that. If we chop the last layer off, we'll get the same similar outcome, and it's an abstract definition within 1,000 dimensions, contrary to the 3 dimensions of the CAD model. Okay. So then if we take another 2 gardens, one an English garden and the other one also a Japanese garden, here is where I think it becomes interesting, because from a more geometrical point of view, these images, if you compare the top 2, so the English garden and the Ryuanji garden, you might think there's actually quite a lot of similarities. There's a round element in the pebble area, there's a horizontal wall kind of in the back, whilst this other Sankei-en garden, which is also Japanese, is a completely different style. However, if we calculate the distance between Ryuanji and Sankei-en, it's a distance of 0.5, whatever that means. It's not really about that. But the distance between the Ryuanji garden and the English one is 1. So they are actually further apart, and this super simple encoding already reveals a manner of being able to speak about qualitative aspects beyond geometry. And the second Japanese garden and the English garden are very similar distance, also 1. But then let's have a further look at, a closer look at the nature of this 3D model, which is the dominant encoding of how we think about architecture within computational processes. So through the dominance of that 3D CAD model as the primary computational encoding of architecture, and the direct propagation of all the other models of communication from this, plan sections, etc., it can be seen as a universal model that mediates representations. And this representation is in the form of a geometry encoded in Cartesian space, following the Euclidean axioms, which we can kind of, in a mathematical sense, we can represent that as a plotting of a 3-dimensional function. And then the linear functions from that are similar to what we use within architecture as the plan, the section. The linear definitions that are derived from that 3-dimensional model. And then I'd like to highlight this quote from Valéry in his book Dialogues, where there's a conversation between Socrates and Phaedrus, where Socrates says, "Nothing inevitable links the concavity of my nose with the convexity of my forehead. And yet your hand is no longer free to stray about on the wall. Now you will something and impose upon your drawing this law from without, that it must reproduce a given form." And I think this is exactly the issue, that if we internalize architecture through a 3D model, that's what we end up as. We're not free to actually think of architecture beyond that 3-dimensional definition. All the other means of communicating that architecture are internalized by that and define it as such. So in my words, the reference to the project as an idea is lost, and as such, there's no encoding. It's just code. When we then look at a quote from Koolhaas in Elements, where he discusses the nature of architectural communication and the creation of space, he, in the quote, talks about how, as architects, we deal with space continuously, but we don't really have an actual vocabulary to deal with that. And I think that's not an issue, but it's something to embrace. The space is something that's gained as an abstract understanding from the means in which we communicate, but it's not encoded. we don't have a vocabulary for it, and we shouldn't think that the geometry which we have here in models is that encoding either. Because, like he says, most architects don't readily know the cubage or even the most iconic spaces. It's not what we need to know. It's the overall quality of that space which we want to convey and communicate. So then, as a conclusion to that, I would like to say that the complete internalization of architectural design into a computational model through Cartesian encoding is unable to successfully communicate abstractions as a design process. And as an analogy to that, I'd like to speak about the square root of 2, which if we try to internalize the square root of 2 within computation, we can use the math function in Python and we get something like this, or we can extend it and make it more accurate. But the problem remains the same, that neither of these is an actual representation of what the square root of 2 is. It doesn't get us any close to the answer and doesn't really communicate what this number, or more likely proportion, actually resembles within a mathematical understanding. Much more effective is something like that, where square root of 2 is a proportion between the two equal sides of of a right triangle. And the square root of 2 is the length of that diagonal. Similarly, you could speak about pi, where pi is the circumference of a circle. It's not 3.14, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't get us any closer. And the nature of computation, by its binary limitations, is that we can't actually calculate it, but we can work with it if we keep referring to it as an idea, so as an encoding and not the code internalization. And then in terms of an architectural context to that, I think in a similar way, there are aspects of architectural design that can be sought to be expressed through the proportionality of its parts, understood through the perception and operations that relate them. Another quote by Ishigami, where he talks to that end, is that the experience of architecture is the manifestation of the totality of perception of the space, as synthesized by the person having the experience. And I think these thoughts are something that have already been explored by Ada Lovelace. And if something has been put through computation with the Turing machine as the archetypical machine, it is not inevitable that the artifact will be flattened if it must be represented as ones and zeros. The potential of computation in this activity was already identified by Ada Lovelace through her insight for the potential of numerical encoding to offer another space to think in. And so she actually coined the idea of encoding music through numerical representation, but she never thought that that numerical representation was the music itself, like actually the discussion we just had. It's the physical versus the encoding. And to me, these considerations seem to be necessary to make an emergent abstraction accessible, meaning that we can start working with it but not internalize it, and something that can be entered instead of it becoming a closed system. So to go back to another quote by Valéry in the same book, later Socrates states, "But the arts of which we speak should, on the contrary, by means of numbers and relations of numbers, engender in us not a fable, but that hidden power which makes all fables." And then, to me, I've spoken a lot about proportions, and square root is a proportion. So in a mathematical sense, that immediately leads to domains and codomains. And this then also relates to a conversation we had yesterday when Nicolas pointed out the difference between the real numbers and the complex numbers. However, if we take the real numbers and the complex numbers as a set, they're isomorphic. They're the same. Like that, we can make an isomorphic projection and they behave in the same manner. So we end up with a projection from the real to the real numbers because we just put them on an axis and represent them like that. However, we can do that also from real numbers to the squared real numbers, same thing. It doesn't really change any form of communicating that in a mathematical nature. Only once we get to an algebraic structure, so groups or fields or vector spaces, then they become non-isomorphic. Because then we need to communicate a function from the complex numbers to another complex numbers plane which we're having to deal with 4 dimensions, and we can't represent that. And it's the operations that make something go from a set to a group. We need to define the addition and the neutral element and the, what's the other one, singular element, to be able to get to that. And we're not dealing with distances anymore, we're dealing with operations and transitions. So then an example of how to, that's not good. Okay. It's completely, okay, no, there we go. So this is a video if it's deciding to play at some point. Okay, let me. Let me do it like that. So one way of visualizing the complex numbers is through this phase plot where from the operation, so the circular operation, we derive a color encoding, which lets us represent the first domain. And from that, once we have this first domain, we can start plotting functions from this domain and how it is changed into the other domain. Now, important to note is that contrary to when we have 2 axes with x, y plot, these plots don't show the codomain and the domain simultaneously. They are shown in different images or representations next to each other, like here. So that's the domain, which is just if the codomain and the domain are the same. If we start plotting a function, it shows the skewing of that original one into a different version. And I think then from here, a architectural interpretation of this, I would like to refer to the modulo by Le Corbusier, where he sets out to describe a scale around which proportionality in architecture evolves. However, one reading of that could be that Le Corbusier presents mystic associations, the golden ratio, the Nautilus shell, tedious references to musical rhythm, or the endless parade of anthropomorphic proportions, according to Andrew Witt in his book Formulations. However, I would kind of argue that it's more to do with harmonics, where the primary way in which the modular scale differs from the anthropomorphic imperial system or that of the linear scale metric system is that the modular takes into account the actions that occur between the invariant knots, as with musical harmonics. And then instead of using mathematical geometry as a means for legitimizing shapes in architecture, let's, based on all of this, start considering the mathematical operations as that which can facilitate accessible abstractions. At the end of the day, according to Gowers, a mathematical object is what it does. Let's see, yes. So in line with that, architecture would then not be concerned with understanding a complex body and embracing its indefinite character to put the related space in proportion, as opposed to crafting systems, creating a complexity of a deterministic nature. Where I'd like to refer to the quote by Foucault, where the problem is no longer one of tradition, of tracing a line, but one of division, of limits. It is no longer one of lasting foundations, but one of transformations that serve new foundations, the rebuilding of foundations. Where I'll come back to this at the end of my talk. I think the most telling thing is that he disregards lasting foundations, but focuses on the re-establishing of foundations, but doesn't say that he wants to create a new one. It's the continuous recreating of foundations. So again, in line with the idea of process. A first experiment that I did in terms of, in the context of my PhD is here kind of looking at how to start using digital environments as means of crafting new projections. Kind of using the metaphor of casting in the context of domains of digital data, where I start creating a topological sphere as a model of a domain. And let's have a look at how that experiment is built up. So as an example, if we take a training data of just RGB values, so three-dimensional, we'll get to the higher dimensional ones later, but if we take 1,000 colors, we create a geodesic dome, and from that, we make a spherical self-organizing map. So here you can see the untrained spherical self-organizing map, which is a random set of colors, then training it for 2 epochs. So that will take a second. We can see that now the colors are nicely organized and they form a transition of the different spaces. So it's a mapping of the overall domain. However, it doesn't completely encompass the domain, but it gives us a means of navigating that. But the main reason I was interested in creating a spherical self-organizing map is to establish an inside and an outside of the plane, which is something of an operation, of a function that we can apply to the data and to the domain, contrary to if we have a flat self-organizing map where we can't establish that. However, if we want to establish a outside and inside on a topological sphere of n dimensions, you'd have to solve n linear equations, which you don't really want to do. Also, it's not very much in line with the machine learning approach because it's all probabilistic anyway. So instead, I just took the PCA component of all of the contents in one cell. And in theory, from a probabilistic point of view, that line should stand perpendicular to the sphere, which, if we look at one cell, it actually kind of works. So from that, we get the perpendicular line to the topological sphere, and then we can start mapping an altitude to the data of the sphere, whether it's inside or outside. So then for the actual experiment, what's the substance of my mold? So I want to create a mold, and I want to start casting interactions with that. So the substance at first is 6,000 books, which I gathered from all of these authors, which are authors of the 20th century. So just writings which are about storytelling. So not philosophical text, but in principle, just text. The main principle about the selection of this is that I didn't want architectural books, but in the first, just stories because they are a pure textual domain. And I want to start casting between text and images. Then the material of the cast are 130,000 art images from the collected, combined collection of the Tate and MoMA. And from that, I want to start shaping a mold. So how do I then shape the mold? So I've got 2 domains. I've got a domain of images and I've got a domain of text, but no way of actually putting these 2 domains into each other's proportion, which is what in my narrative of the casting is what it is. Like if we create a mold to cast something from it, it's 2 different materials which are distinct to each other, but one facilitates the creation of the other by some form of crystallization. Now, when we have stable diffusion, the transition of text to image is mostly based on these kind of tags. So here I just took an image from MVRDV, and then in the depth of the HTML, you can find that according to Instagram, that may be an image of 4 people, a skyscraper, buildings, and a tower. However, that doesn't really actually communicate what that project is about. It's just just a description of text of what the image is, and it's the same, to me, that's the same domain. So it's not an encoding into a new domain of a transition, but it's actually collapsing the image and the text into one and the same. So we end up still in the set. When we think of earlier, if we don't add operations, if we don't keep a distinction and a proportionality, we end up collapsing it into the same domain, and we don't really get any further. So, and that's exactly what Clip does. It's useful because it collapses 2 different type of media into one that we can work with. I'll leave that. So then I'd go to the second meaning of casting, and that's a distinctive and typical style, form, or character. So it's then suddenly to do about a character. and it's about casting a person into a role. And then I thought, okay, that kind of possibly gives the opportunity to start creating such a proportion, because we don't try and make it one and the same in the geometry where the one is the negative of the other, but it's some form of play. So as the molding data, I took 68,000 frames with subtitles from 52 films from Panoramas of Cinema, a subset of that, and started working with that. So these are the films that I took. And then from the association of how people speak about things in a setting, in a film, we start being able to project from text to the image domain. So let's have a look. So the current output is this. So we have a spherical sum of images on the left, and we've got a spherical sum of text on the right. It doesn't look like a sphere, but it is a sphere. Then if we type playing models in here, I get 10 texts that are related to what I write at the bottom, which I can tweak. So I can say, okay, I want another cell for this one, I want another cell for that one, and based on the selection of text that I want to speak about and that I want to see associations of in the art images, I can get a projection. And then in here, I can see, okay, this is apparently an interesting part. I can click a cell, and I can see which images are outside. So this is the surface of the self-organizing map, and these are inside. However, a limitation of this, as you can see, is that because I trained it on films, and the art piece have one corner of photos, the current projection is very biased towards photographic images, because that's what it picked up on. But so that's kind of a next step that I'll want to address, which I'm not entirely sure yet, but we'll see how. Okay, then one thing that we can then also do is that we can have a look at what are these projections based on, so the films. So here, I look at cell 891, that was this one, at altitude 0.109, and I want the top 5 films which relate to that text, and that then inform the image projection onto the art set. So from that, this will take a second. So now it's extracting the right frames and the small video clips, because for kind of keeping the data small, I just extracted the screenshots and the actual clips aren't visible. Let me put that on this. Maybe I should have done 3 instead of 5. But let me. Yes, should be done. Okay, so the first one from that. Okay, no, it's not. I thought it was done. Was this one? So obviously, this is another issue that the subtitles that I'm currently working with, it has the audio description, so that's another issue I have to adjust, where I only pick up on conversation. I think the third one was quite funny. So that's my current work in progress on that, and trying to get a temperament of being able to deal with images and text without it becoming a translation, but it actually keeping the proportionality of how we speak in spaces and what the image associations are from that. An earlier, how much time have I got? I think I will show this trailer. So an earlier project I did as part of my graduation from my master's in architecture is the following project, where it looks at using multiple different methods and algorithmic approaches to start defining a curation of art pieces in Venice, and from that start inferring geometric definitions. So it's not necessarily creating 1,297 art galleries in full detail, but it is about first creating a manner of curation of proportions of art pieces which respond to the current context, and from that infer what type of spaces might actually be decent geometrical bounds to facilitate the reading and the viewing of those art galleries. I can lower the volume here. Okay, so I think that's enough of the trailer. The first approach of this was gathering a complete, reading Venice fully on its digital terms. So I gathered, I believe it was about 300,000 Flickr photos with geolocations in Venice, and from the locations I started to read what places there were in Venice. Not looking at the actual present geometry of the city, but only about the distribution of these coordinates and whether there was a bias of where these places were, going on the assumption that if there's no bias, then it must act as a place, because there's no geometry that actually changes the way in which these densities of points are photographed. Then it's the same data set that I used for the spherical SOM, so the entire collection of Tate and MoMA, where this facilitated the transition from images to a geometry, because all of these art pieces have a size, and they are completely documented in the data set. So from that, I started being able to start proposing a geometrical shape, which then from that, it relates to this organization where it's based on the image features and encoding through also mobile net, and then creating a minimum spanning tree of the entire transition of each art collection. Oh yeah, the art collections are all based on the photos taken in one location. So through the method, I got something like 2,000 different locations in Venice. Each got their art collection based on the most similar pieces to the photos taken in that place. And then this created a form of hierarchy and transition within the collection. And on the left, you can see an initial massing of how these art pieces actually determine the shape of the rooms based on main branches and side branches. And as you saw in this video, there's one big image at the start, and I wanted to introduce an alien thing in that, because I didn't want to create one art piece which stands as the representative of the art piece or of the art gallery. So I used a generative network adversarial network to create art pieces for each art collection to represent the overall features and characteristics of each collection. Mostly not under the pretense that these are new art pieces, but they serve as an average of a representation of each art gallery from which the entire tree is organized. Then, through a whole set of algorithmic approaches and the organization of the art pieces, each gallery was completely generated based on the geometric constraints and circulation necessities to be able to actually reach every room. So using visibility graphs and minimum spanning trees to finally get to a fully developed geometry, which I'll scroll through this a bit. Where it's kind of one thing to highlight here is that there were kind of additional abstract definitions of design features, which I think those are the parts where I actually take some agency in a design sense, where I say, okay, if the staircase from one place to another has room to expand and is beyond a certain height, then it starts projecting itself outwards to different areas here and here, so that you get these kind of feature staircases. So these things are not developed per gallery. They're defined on a complete scale of the entire project, and they come through in places where, they fit. And I don't have any particular further control over that. which then lead to a new map of Venice with 1,297 different possibilities of galleries with their respective collections. And a booklet which shows all of the representative art pieces and the number of art pieces in each gallery and where they are and where you can find them in the cell on the overall overview, etc. And none of this was hand modeled, so that's kind of important to stress. Each then fully rendered with all the materialities, and where the materials were also based on the image similarities of material palettes to the overall image features of the collection of each gallery. I mean, there's quite a lot of these tiny boxes because then it's a really small place in Venice with like 3 art pieces, and it doesn't really go further into the algorithm. Where there's sometimes 500, then it goes and it creates the whole thing. And then yeah, I rendered only 300 because then my laptop fried and it was it was done. Okay, then finally I'd like to talk a bit about my the studio that I've been teaching at Bartlett. For the first 2 years I was teaching with Philippe, and you saw some of the work there, and we already emphasized a lot on the computational literacy of the students. So we didn't have one particular method that we imposed on the students, but we gave them a task and a set of these machine learning models and algorithmic knowledge to then start developing their own methods to propose a new urban vision for La Défense, which was much more based on quantitative data and analysis of the traffic, analysis of the buildings that were there. And in the last year, I ended up teaching RC11 on my own, most of it, where there was a shift from quantitative data to more qualitative data. So the emphasis was still on making the students engage with computational knowledge and also mathematical background of computation and gain understanding in that, to then start producing their own proposals of how they might read an urban setting through these methods. So I'll show 3 of the projects from last year. The first one mostly used film. So they used an activity model, a pre-trained activity model, to start recomposing different views of Istanbul, where they thought that Istanbul, through its cultural nature, has different faces, and whichever way you represent the city, it's always just one face and one representation of that, where the 4 faces they then chose was 4 libraries of films taking place in Istanbul. One was spy films, one art house, one YouTube video, and one documentary. So these are the 4 faces, none more true or less true than the other, but they are different characterizations of the city, from which they then start using the model to, from an original video which they take in the city, start creating these different representations of what that video might look like in the other 4 masks. Which you can see here.
I've never been to Istanbul.
You've never been to Istanbul?
I'm going to be in Istanbul this Christmas.
Where? Istanbul!
Welcome to Istanbul.
So on the bottom left, you can see their video, which they filmed themselves in Istanbul. On the top left, it's the art house version. Top right
So
is the
he'll
vlog.
be here for the bazaar.
Bottom left,
All right,
the
guys, we
spy
have
film.
entered
Bottom
into
right,
the Grand
documentary.
Bazaar.
So
It's good to
they
be back.
created their own search
Now
engine
we've
to
gotta find-
index all of these videos and then give one video as input, and from that it suggests 4 other versions of that same scene.
They appear to be on the rooftops of the Grand Bazaar.
So from that, they then start kind of creating these characters which they get from the 4 different masks and start proposing geometries from them, or reading geometries from them more like. So they use photogrammetry to start creating kind of video scenes into geometry, and use the segment anything model to actually take more specific parts of this, because they're not interested in the entire geometry. It's certain characteristics from the different features and from the different scenes that they want to highlight, which then with these other like kind of linking and hacking these models together, they create their own method of communicating these new things and getting fragments of these characters into a geometrical domain, which leads to this library of objects, which they then start placing into one space in the city, which looks like this. So you can see the original parts, but they're linked with all the different four faces. So you've got one face of the spy films, but it's kind of simultaneous with all the other three masks, which are blended into one same location. So you've got four different versions of Roof of the Grand Bazaar. You've got four different versions of the Hagia Sophia, which are blended into one new version of that to represent this multi-faceted nature of the city. And then they added an activity and kind of recognition to have these screens where the activities of the original films are projected onto. So we had one project that dealt with film. The second one dealt with objects, using kind of engaging with the nature of how objects and street objects, similar to props in films, tell stories about the city and how it can create new readings of what these scenes are and enrich the reading of the urban context through that. Heavily based on Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence, where it's a museum of a lot of random objects, it seems, but it goes together with his novel, and as a combination, it starts to create a more qualitative reading of the actual book, of the story. So they scraped a bunch of objects from Sketchfab, they trained their own object detection model, and they collected a large amount of texts, and from those texts they started identifying parts of text which spoke about the 24 different types of objects they got and put that into a self-organizing map. So they get three-dimensional versions of objects, they get story versions of objects from books taking place in Istanbul, and as a... Oh, why is this not charging? This is not switched. I think this thing is not working. Okay. Oh. So from that, they start. The first experiment was taking a 3D model and using Stable Diffusion to then link it to different stories that talk about objects of similar nature, to then get different renderings and visions of what that object might look like, colored by the stories that they extracted from Istanbul. I'll go a bit quicker. So the final idea was to then start creating and introducing these objects into street scenes and recreate the objects based on the narratives that are associated with them. And the idea is then, by instilling these objects which are placed in the city with these stories and enriching them through that, also the reading of the urban context around them will be colored by that, which then that type of how a perception of the model of an object influences the context around it is seen here, if this thing is working. Yes, so then they use the segment anything model again to then start placing these objects, which were redesigned based on the narratives, in front of a wall, where the wall was rendered by the combined stories, and then in the segment anything, each part of the scene was recolored by the kind of typology of each object. So this is the first scene, which is taken from the narrative of the combined objects that stand in front of the wall through Stable Diffusion. But then with the segment anything combination, the trash can in front of here makes colors the entire scene into a trash kind of area. The fountain recolors this scene into another interpretation, and through that the association of scene and object is visualized using these transitions from image to text. finally ending in also kind of a more conceptual proposal of a park with a lot of different street objects and walls behind them that represent the overall stories from which these objects were designed, and more specific areas where it bleeds into the effect on the scene. Then the final project was dealt with texts, and they were interested in how a reading of the urban design is, in their mind, a conflict of top-down and bottom-up design methodologies. And it's not one or the other, but it's the conflict of this which is what makes a city interesting. So from that, they started to create a narrative where they take Marco Polo and Kublai Khan as their two main protagonists. They picked 50 books from top-down architectural theory, 50 books of bottom-up architectural theory, created a self-organizing map of each of them using TF-IDF, and those were their two characters that they wanted to put into conflict with each other. So they start speaking with these two fictional characters of Marco Polo and Kublai Khan to create the idea of conflict between these two types of urban theory. So from that, they start speaking with this, and they say something that they're interested in terms of the design for the city of Istanbul, and they start picking the opinions of either Kublai Khan or Marco Polo, which one they find more interesting. So it's not a combination of both. They don't listen to both for every point, but they pick which one they think has it more right in terms of what they actually want to speak about in terms of of their design process. Then from that, they start creating further text data sets. So they got all ArcDaily categories of architectural projects and put those into ChatGPT to get a description from them. So they can get the synthesized, combined opinions of Kublai Khan and Marco Polo, put that into a new self-organizing map of, a new comparison of TF-IDF to architectural categories. And they do the same with all the different types of activities that are indexed by the pre-trained activity film model. So they also get then proposals of what activities might take place in areas that Marco Polo and Kublai Khan are speaking about. From that, they then put that into a film classification model where they get the different activities from art, large data set of art films in terms of a mood board of what that space might look like in terms of the activities taking place. So here it's marching, tasting beer, and sailing in a matrix of each sorted by the different things taken from their overall art film database. Finally, then taking a protagonist, which is an architect, from which they then scrape all the projects of that particular architect from ArcDaily to get the descriptions of those projects in order to start creating a visual representation of the geometric nature of what a project might look like based on the descriptions of Kublai Khan and Marco Polo. For that, they first took inspiration from elements of architecture from Koolhaas, but they didn't want to keep it in a discrete manner, but they scraped Google Images based on those categories, created a self-organizing map of all the images in Istanbul from those categories, and then by taking a project description from in the case study OMA, they get a project description, they get images from the project, and they project those images from that particular project back onto the self-organizing map of elements of Istanbul, by which they get a sense of what elements might be of use in terms of if OMA would design something based on the brief of Marco Polo and Kublai Khan. And then as a kind of an outcome, it was a team of two. They created this little booklet of what working with this tool might look like to start ideating a design process by this kind of brief aiding method that they created. And I think to me the most important thing is still that they don't particularly redevelop a new model. They take ready-made models, but they start chaining it together because they know how to take them, they understand what the vectorization of data is, and they start being able to navigate these things and design with them in novel ways. So then if this is still, so then the end of year exhibition looked like this, very nice. I was quite happy with them. So they put it together all themselves. I think it looked quite fun. And I'd like to finish with another quote by Ishigami, where in an interview, also asking about the Design of Kate workshop, the interviewer asks, so to you, computerization or an information-oriented world, things like that aren't reasons to try creating a new base. Think back to Foucault earlier. So I guess I don't think it can be done. Not meaning, of course, that there isn't going to be a base. I just think since the base and the output have to be working simultaneously, they naturally ought to be built at the same time. So for me, all of these exercises which I'm doing with the Sphere or the gallery project or the projects that my students are doing aren't about creating a new universal model that will create architecture for us. It's not like a grasshopper that generates objects, but it's actually being able to understand what encoding of architectural ideas is in a digital manner, which will help us create new ways of working with digital tools and computation to continuously create new bases without ever settling on one. Thank you.
So, your last conversation between Ishigami and I don't remember the other, I hope it was you, which was saying, it is not, like I need to do this simultaneously. So I need to engage with the Sphere, and then I need to also do all of this with my students. So when I think about the Sphere example that you have, I always thought that you do this because with the two-dimensional sum, it's very weird how you think of the corners when you're analyzing your data, because a lot of the data, when you're clustering them, usually goes to the corners. But when you do a sum, a spherical one, it's trying to really attach those corners into a more spectrum-like idea. So then everything is there's no prominence in the clustering. So I was trying to my question is the following. So I see that you're working with a two-dimensional sum with your students. Are you planning with this research that you're doing with your PhD to try to create this spherical representation of data and multimodality fusion for this type of study that you're doing with them?
Possible, but so the teaching with my students is really that in terms of skills, I give 5 lectures. One of them is on film, one of them is on text, one of them is on algorithmic kind of functions, and then one is on the Godot game engine. And then they have to kind of take that as starting points and start learning themselves. Maybe, well, actually, and in the algorithmic approach, I also include then the SOM. And last year, that was when I did the workshop, I didn't have the spherical SOM yet, so then it was still a normal square one. Maybe I will show them the spherical one. I think I will probably show them and give them the code, but whether they then end up using that one or if they choose a square one, that's kind of up to them. And I kind of want to encourage them to keep making those choices themselves and see what the advantages are. And I think for me, the spherical SOM still has many flaws. Like it's quite because I recoded the whole thing from scratch and it's based on arc distances instead of linear distances. It needs still a bit of work to get to the same level of a standard library, which is probably a much more sophisticated implementation of the self-organizing map learning method. So it kind of depends. I think there's advantages to both. I don't think, for instance, the text group, I think it's actually quite nice that they just have these 2 square things which start in kind of in a conversation with each other. Also because the data required for a square SOM is much lower. You don't end up with 800 cells immediately. So that helps. So it's kind of on a project-to-project basis, I guess, is my answer.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Julian, for the presentation. I don't have a question regarding the student work because I know that part a bit better. But I'm obviously, I'm very interested in the first part of your work, which is, let's say, more personal also as well. And I completely share this problem of how do we share an abstract concept, you know, and definitely sharing the geometry or sharing the image or sharing the numerical value, or you took the example of pi, defining pi as 3.14, etc., is not the same as using pi as a concept. Also without even having to give the numerical value of pi. I mean, in most mathematics, it's funny, but the numerical value is never used, you know? So it's obviously super interesting. I wonder, because you use this quote by Tim Gowers, like a mathematical object is what it does. And obviously, with the example of pi, it's kind of obvious. But did you try to push this idea further in your personal investigation? Because I have the feeling that at the moment you identify the problem, you speak about it really well with reference to Paul Valéry and some other thinkers in a very smart way, conceptually speaking. But in a way, why not trying to just to do it? You know, like if Gower says a mathematical object is what it does, then why not trying to see what this architectural object or concept or whatever are doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the spherical sum is a first attempt at starting to think about a means of facilitating an architectural communication that remains between different modalities and doesn't try to collapse them into a geometrical definition. And then the more mathematical perspective that I want to integrate into the research is more from the point of view of first group theory, then topology, and then finally maybe category theory, where, I mean, so pi is obvious because it's not a rational number and it's we can't really work with it. But at the end of the day, if you take the number 1 in group theory, it's not a number. It's a construct within a group, and that has a certain role to play. And I think that's the way to understand the quote from Gowers as well, is that it's not about only these really strange numbers, but actually it's true for anything as long as you start speaking about it mathematically. And that, I think, is then the thought behind the spherical sum as a first attempt at starting to facilitate some form of working with that in relation to architecture. But here it's not, I guess it's architectonic, would the kind of Lutger and the chair of architectonics say, because it's about proportionalities between different incommensurable things. And that's then the reason of taking text and images as the furthest kind of polar extents of architectural communication. And then on the same axes would be plans and sections. But it's much easier at this first conceptual stage to start working with them as texts and images. And that's the kind of mathematical perspective on that. And within the PhD, the idea is to do these more computational experiments, such as a spherical sum, and then reflect on them. What does that mean from a group theory perspective? How do these things actually stand in proportion? What are the operations within the sets of images, and what are the operations within the sets of texts, and how do they stand in proportion? How do they actually communicate to each other in the same way in which the complex numbers are, in a way, 2 times the set of the real numbers, but it's the proportionality and the operations that actually make it into a distinguished type of numerical system.
It's not really a question, but it's. So I'm really love your work, and especially your master thesis. I think this is one of the best master theses I ever seen in architecture, and I'm a little bit disappointed, I cannot not say it, that we don't have many students here in an architecture school to see this master project, because last year I was doing a museum with them, And it took a lot of time to realize how things should be connected in a museum, how large it can be, how can we organize walking through it, and then for them to see that you made an algorithm which designed 1,400 of them, complete with all the materialization and rendering, all this. So I would hope that some of them are still watching this or will be watching this on YouTube. So just my message to them is that perhaps they should think about the future more seriously than they actually do right now. And also, I'm not really sure what better thing they have to do than watch your lecture. But okay.
Well, if you can show my screen. So for students, if they want to see it, go to unit21.com. That's the unit where I did it. And then onto, not that one, this one. That's the entire project is on there.
I think what your work does is really illustrate the urgency of having to learn to take computation seriously. And it's really, for me, very, very clear. I wish I had a master student like you. I mean, probably will never have, but like, yeah, really incredible. And just one small thing, I have to a little bit take you upon something. You know, when we talk about, you said, 3.14, whatever, 1.447.
I don't know past 1.4, but
yeah, I don't know as well. That's why. But like, okay, that kind of is it's a kind of residue of pi. No, it's not really pi. No, but in the same then, when you said, we have two, and you repeated it again, you have Argand plane, so two-dimensional plane, which can be used to represent complex numbers. That's also in a way like saying, yeah, but what does 3.14 really tells us about pi? Because 2D plane can represent it, but it says nothing about how the thing works. Because obviously multiplication and division in complex numbers is completely different beast. And this is what allows us to use complex numbers in quantum theory to rotate things, to display probability amplitudes as they rotate through all possible paths from one point to another. So yeah, so I would not make that plane perhaps.
No, I mean that only if you regard them as sets. Mm-hmm. As soon as you look at them as a group, then that obviously falls apart, and that's exactly what you said. And in quantum mechanics, you only use them as a group. Like, we don't really use numbers as sets. It's useless. And that's also kind of my issue with current machine learning methods, is that these things that come out of them are sets. They're not groups, because they only have a distance. They're an ordered set, sure, because we can measure things, but there's no way of actually using them in an algebraic way. And that's
your motivation to actually go into spherical sums so that you can have perpendicular. Okay.
Yes, that's the reason, because then you start having a rotation, you start having an inside and an outside, which is already a distinction of a sort of nature of an operation, which you don't have if it's just distance.
Have you tried the toroidal sum?
No.
I developed it. It's on GitHub, so you can download
it. Okay, I will. Great. Great. Yes, all good.
Sorry. So I know this is maybe like a larger discussion to some degree, but I'm just wondering because with this and many other methods we saw earlier, questing, and these seems they're all kind of methods of navigating a vast, let's say, space, right? And earlier even we were kind of discussing kind of physicality, and these things are generally more relational, vectorial, representational, logical, versus like the physicality, physics of the real world, right? And in the Ishigami, of course, in Praise of Shadows, is sort of text that's kind of talking about the kind of experience, right, of being in many ways. And I'm wondering, in the case of like, let's say Istanbul, and actually many exercises we do that sometimes seem sort of plucked out of context and pieced back together, I'm kind of really wondering about how artificial intelligence can help us understand things on that level, right? Not necessarily a sort of series of connections between dots, whether it's in a sphere or a square grid or map, but I think like that's kind of part of why you're trying to do it in a sphere, because you're looking for an additional dimension of relationships that kind of speak to us on a different level.
Interesting question. So I think I'll try and have a stab at answering it, but I don't think I'll be able to fully answer it because it's kind of it's in line with the main question of my PhD as well. But I think in terms of the sensorial experience of architecture and how to communicate that with AI, I'm not even sure that that is completely possible. I think we as humans, as being the sensorial people that actually experience it, need to be able to mediate that in order to give rise to that understanding. And I think that's then also in line with my first critique on the 3D model, that as soon as we think that the full architectural idea is internalized within the computer, we lose the actual the nature of architectural design as an idea. So I don't think necessarily machine learning will be able to represent that fully. It might be able to associate to it. And I think that's the approach I would take, is that these machine learning methods might be able to start creating associations that pertain to sensorial experiences, but we need to then still deal with those to understand those and convey them as an idea. It's just that the machine learning methods might offer us new ways of communicating that. In the same way then that the perspective drawing of Alberti is not a new internalization of architecture. Like, those perspective drawings aren't the architecture. They're just a new way of communicating that architecture through new techniques. And I think that's then also the way in which we should think about the sensorial nature of architecture and how machine learning might be a new way of communicating that, but it won't be able to internalize it.
I think maybe the reason I asked that is also related to Nicola's kind of question. As educators, so I've been thinking about students, is that, you know, sometimes it seems like you take students somewhere, so let's say, you know, Sydney Opera House, you know, there's more impetus nowadays to like take a selfie with Sydney Opera House and say I visited it, right, as opposed to kind of like giving it time to experience. And I think also has to do with the sort of vast amount of data anxiety that we have to absorb everything, as opposed to, let's say, experiencing certain things.
Yeah, I think more from a kind of educating point of view, what I tried to do over the last year, which I think is a difference from many things within the B Pro, is that a lot of the B Pro projects are very much engaged from the idea of optimization and solving a problem. And that's kind of the thing I try to do this year and will continue doing over the next years, to break students away from the idea that they can solve everything with computation, and it just use it as a new way of exploring stuff and playing with it. And that's, I think, it was very nice to see how quickly the students actually kind of got on with that and embraced it and really enjoyed it. And that was very good. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.